Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my monthly reflections video where we talk about the things that I worked with throughout the month of January. So I wanted to change things up a little bit this year in my monthly reflections videos. I wanted to share with you not only the decks that I've been working with and the decks that I'm studying, but I also wanted to share with you some of the books that I've been reading. So let's go ahead and jump right in with the decks that I've been working with and the decks that I've been studying throughout the month of January. So to start things off in the new year, I decided to work with just a handful of decks to really focus in on kind of familiarizing myself more with these particular decks. Now, these decks here that I worked with are all, with the exception of the Wild Unknown Tarot, are all new decks or fairly new decks to my collection that I received in 2020. So I hadn't really had much of a chance to work with them yet. So I thought, new year, fresh start, let's work with some new decks. So I did something a little bit differently this month. Rather than pairing one tarot and one oracle to work with together all throughout a week, what I did was I intermixed all of these decks together in various combinations throughout the month. So we'll talk about that here in a moment, but I just want to kind of go through each deck individually and share my thoughts and my experiences working with them. I did have a couple of sort of bonus decks that made their way into my readings in January, so we'll talk about those as well. So let's start with the Naked Heart Tarot. Now, this is a deck that I purchased from Lisa when she was doing one of her declutters, maybe, or maybe she just had a second copy. I cannot remember now. Anyway, this is a deck that I've actually wanted for quite some time. I have kind of used and abused the guidebook so much now that the pages are actually starting to fall out. So I'm gonna have to do something about that. But it is a stunning deck. It's an indie deck, of course. It is, however, available on Amazon. So if it's something that you're interested in, I did leave the extra card in. And you can see here, like, the artwork is just enchanting. It's so beautiful. The illustrations totally make sense for each of the cards, but for whatever reason, whenever I was doing readings with it, it just really wasn't clicking for me. And I just had, I mean, look at this, Two of Wands. It's awesome. Individually, maybe that's what it is. Individually, I really enjoy these cards. In a spread or working with them with other decks, it just didn't quite click for me. So beautiful deck. Love this Fool card. And I love all the foxes in it because, you know, right now I'm really exploring that fox energy, which does definitely keep coming up for me. And I love that this one has all the foxes in it, but it just didn't work for me really well in terms of my readings. I really only found that it connected well for me when I read with it in conjunction with the guidebook. And the guidebook is amazing. I've really enjoyed the guidebook. If I pulled a single card and I really dove into the guidebook and into the messages, this deck worked beautifully for me. When I tried to pair it with other decks, it just kind of fell a little flat, or maybe it just got lost in all the other decks. Because of maybe its white space or its minimalist nature, this is a quiet deck for me. And I found that when I mixed it in with other cards, it just kind of fell into the background. It didn't really, I don't want to say it didn't really stand on its own, because as a single card draw, when I did use this deck for single card draws, that worked much better for me. But when I tried to use multiple cards, either to do one solid reading from this deck, just using multiple cards, or working with this deck in conjunction with other decks, it just kind of fell to the back. It just kind of got overpowered by everything else. Certainly when I paired it with other decks, it's a very quiet deck. And for single card pulls, I think that's fantastic because I could really focus in on that single message. Like I said, the guidebook is amazing, so I really enjoyed working with that and worked with that very intensively when I did those single card pulls. But I found that trying to work with it in a larger spread or with other decks just really didn't work for me. It's just a little too quiet. It's a little too subdued for that kind of work, I think, for me. And it did kind of make it a little bit a little bit more difficult for me to want to work with, because I found that it was a little bit, again, for me personally, it was a little bit limited in that I felt like I could only really connect with it when I connected with one card at a time. And not to say that that's a bad thing, because that gives me the opportunity to really focus mindfully on that one card, and to really dive into this beautiful guidebook, which is kind of hard to read. You can see here, there's where pages are popping out. It's a little bit hard to work with just because the binding is so tight and the book is so small, but the write-ups that are in here are fantastic, and I really, really enjoyed those. That was where this deck really shined for me, was working in the single card pulls. Adding it to other things just really kind of overpowered this little deck, and I just didn't feel that it had a chance to really speak if I had other things on the table with it. But I did really enjoy getting the chance to get to know this deck this month. It was a fun experience. I really enjoyed working with the guidebook, and it was great to get a chance to really spend some time with it, because it's a deck that I had received in 2020 but hadn't really gotten around to using yet. So the other primary tarot deck that I worked with throughout the month of January is the Wild Unknown Tarot. This is, of course, the mass market edition. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos with this deck and I, when I did the VR to Candy about the Dating the Tarot, I could have put this deck in multiple categories. It is very much an on-again, off-again deck for me. It's also been a very slow burner deck for me. It's one that has taken me quite a bit of time and effort to get to know and to really come to appreciate. And it's not necessarily because the cards are hard to work with. It's just taken me a bit of time to come around to maybe its energy. I'm not entirely sure what it is about this deck. Sometimes it really, really speaks to me, and sometimes the messages fall a little bit flat. The guidebook for this deck is very basic, so I don't tend to use it because it just kind of gives you your pretty much your traditional meanings. So I do read this deck a little bit more in line with my own personal kind of way of reading, which is a little bit elemental, a little bit numerological, and then a little bit, maybe a little RWS thrown in there depending on the imagery in the card. Definitely more numerological and elemental in my case, and for the most part, this deck actually does work quite well for that, and that is one of the things that I do really appreciate about it. I love that Hierophant, is that it does allow you, it is open enough to be able to work with in a different way if you don't read necessarily 100% with the Waite-Smith structure in mind. And so this deck works beautifully for that. But again, we just kind of have a stormy relationship. Sometimes I really love it, and sometimes I'm like, you're not really working for me. In January, it did work quite well for me. I really enjoyed working with it. And in particular, this is a deck that I enjoy working with more when I pair it with other things. Kind of complete opposite to the Naked Heart, because the Naked Heart I prefer to work with on its own, just one card at a time. And the Wild Unknown, I'm not really fond of just working with it all on its own. I think it works beautifully and much better for me when I pair it with other things. As a standalone, it doesn't read very well for me, but when I use other decks, particularly Oracle, but sometimes Tarot, it really does kind of help draw that deeper message out for me. So that was the other main tarot deck that I worked with in January, and that's the Wild Unknown Tarot. We'll see it here with some pairings in just a moment, but I just kind of wanted to talk about each one briefly just so that we could see each deck on its own. So the primary Oracle deck that I worked with in January was the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit, and this is the Indie edition, which was gifted to me by a friend because I have been wanting this deck for a long time and was like, I'm gonna get the mass market edition, and she said, I want to send you the indie edition instead. And so thank you very much. I have really enjoyed working with it. It is a beautiful deck. And again, this is another one that I found the connections for me really were in tapping into the guidebook, because just pulling out these animal cards without referencing the guidebook, I really didn't have any idea what they stood for. I mean, you can kind of get an idea based on the artwork, of course. I could add my own intuitive layers to it, of course. But where this deck really shined for me was just by diving into that guidebook and letting it really kind of form the foundation of the message. And at that point, it really was actually more almost like bibliomancy than it was working with cards or cartomancy, because I pulled the card, but the card was kind of just the indicator of which page to go to in the guidebook. And I didn't really find myself tapping into the energy or the imagery on the card. What I found myself really diving into was what was in the guidebook. And so, whereas I tend to use the guidebooks to support to my my readings in terms of, you know, looking up additional information or looking to see what the creator had intended, this deck kind of worked opposite for me, because I kind of used this in an almost like bibliomancy sense, where I shuffled, I pull a card, and then I immediately went to the guidebook, and that's where all of my messages came from. I didn't really look to the artwork to provide any additional meaning or layers or anything of that nature. And it's not to say that they're not there, I just didn't find myself doing that. And so that was really interesting, because that's really the only time, or this is really the only deck that I can think that I've ever really done that with, where I haven't really let some key aspect of a card form a focal point, and I used it more as just a sort of shuffle the deck, pull the card, and then go to the guidebook and work from that. It's just a beautiful little guidebook. I have seen, I think it was Nina from Shuffled Tarot had written the kind of key phrases down here. So for each card, there's a when in balance, when out of balance, and to bring into balance. And she wrote all that on the outside of the cards, which is really wonderful. I thought about doing that, but the way that I was working with this deck, like I said, was more to just point me in the direction that I need to go in the guidebook. And I really enjoyed reading the whole message. And so I could have used this just as bibliomancy too, and just kind of went to a page and there's my animal. But it is fun to use my cards, shuffle, pull an animal, and then just go to the guidebook here. But I definitely found that that is the way that I worked with this deck, was not so much focusing in on the cards, but just using the cards to kind of point me in the right direction to the book, and then everything kind of flowed from there. Don't usually do, because usually it's the other way around, right? I use the cards as the focal point, and then reference a guidebook should I need to, or should I need additional information or clarity. And so that was really interesting experience, just to have that kind of backwards for once. But I really enjoyed working with the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit. It's definitely a deck that I will pull from again, and for sure a guidebook that I will reference again. So the next main Oracle deck that I worked with in January is the Connected and Free Alchemist Oracle. This one is currently out of print. I did manage to get a copy that I purchased from a lovely person on Instagram, and it's been on my wish list for a really long time, so I was really happy to finally get a hold of this one. I really enjoyed my work with this deck. My only issue is that the cards are quite long, and so I did have a bit of a struggle shuffling them and working with them in that way. But I absolutely love the imagery in this deck. I don't have a guidebook. I don't think it comes with a guidebook. There might be a digital guidebook online. I'm not entirely sure, but I really enjoy the imagery. And I find that I don't think I really need a guidebook, because between the artwork and the keywords on the cards, that's plenty for me to be able to tap into. So a little bit different than the Animal Spirit, because you know, I don't need anything more to kind of give me an indication of what's going on, or to really kind of stir my intuition. I can pull a card from this and get plenty just based on what I'm seeing on the card, and then combining that with whatever else is on the table, because context is very important in a reading, and depending on what else is going on around it really does help inform the meaning of the card for me. And so it's just one that I really enjoyed working with. I worked with it alongside both the Naked Heart and the Wild Unknown, and it worked beautifully with that. I will share with you here in just a moment how I actually worked with these decks together primarily. We'll see a lot of that in my tarot journal as well. Really lovely production quality. The cardstock feels the same as the Wild Unknown, but it's just a little bit taller, and so it was a little bit more difficult for me to shuffle, but I did really enjoy working with it. So that was the Connected and Free Alchemist Oracle. So before we talk about how I paired the decks, I just wanted to share real quick a couple of decks that also snuck their way into my readings this last month, and that is the Black Lily Tarot. This is a deck that I turn to quite often when I need some hard truth, when I don't want any fluff. Nudity warning in this deck. This deck for me is a truth teller, and when I need that bit of harsh truth, that harsh reality, and not harsh in a bad way, just no nonsense. Here's what you need to know. Quit messing around. This is the deck that I turn to, and so I did find myself actually working with this deck a couple of different times throughout the month. I did a couple of different readings. It wasn't one that I really intended to work with. It wasn't one that I like pulled out at the beginning of the month like I did with these other decks to say I'm going to work with these decks this month. But it's one that kept sneaking its way into my readings. And so I did do a couple of readings with this. I also paired it with the Connected and Free, which was really beautiful. And it's just one that I really enjoy when I am looking for that really honest, those honest readings, the ones that are, can be a little bit hard hitting, but you definitely know that you're being led to the message that you really, really do need, even if it's not necessarily the message that you want. And we're gonna sneak one more little deck in here before we talk about the pairings, because I did find myself playing with my little Morgan Greer in a tin because it's just so dang cute. And it's been sitting out on my table. And so I find that it's one that I've just been pulling just for fun, just to do kind of in the moment readings or just a card pull for what do I need to know right this 5 minutes, right? They're not anything that I journaled. You won't see this deck or any of those readings in my journal because they were just in the moment readings. But the Morgan Greer has definitely become one of my favorites. I love the energy of this deck. I love the artwork and the colors. I love all the mustaches. And I don't know if it's because it's just new, it's a novelty, or because it was sitting on my desk, like just actually sitting out here, or all of the above, but I did find myself just kind of pulling this deck and giving it a shuffle and doing just some little in-the-moment readings with it, which was really lovely. I really enjoy working with these little mini decks. They're a great size. They're really easy to handle. They're easy for me to shuffle. And I do really like that they are in a tin because that means I can just, throw them in my bag if I'm going somewhere and I do want to take a deck. And I'm guessing that this is probably going to be the one that I am grabbing for a while at least because I'm really enjoying my work with it. So my basic idea at the start was to have a tarot card to provide me with a message. I wanted to have a sort of guiding card for the month and then an animal, which that's an egg. But let's just pull the lamb. Funny, I have an animal here. But this was kind of my original thought and how I had kind of intended to work with these decks together. So in this case, what I did was I kind of had like the tarot card would be the main message. So we'd have the 9 of Pentacles. That would be our main focal point message. The energy would be coming through the Oracle card for surrender. And then the animal energy that we would be tapping into would be beaver. And so that was kind of my initial intention for these decks, was to kind of work these readings in this particular way, which you'll see in my tarot journal. I did do quite often. I did end up working with these 3 decks more than any of the others. The Naked Heart I ended up using more for my Wednesday daily journaling prompt, and we'll talk about that more when we take a look at my tarot journal. And that worked beautifully for that. But as far as my pairings, I found that these cards worked a little bit better together for me. As I mentioned, the Naked Heart just kind of got washed away. I mean, as you can see here, it kind of gets overpowered by everything else when we are working with these cards together. So even when I put the Naked Heart in the middle and I do the animal with it and say the Connected and Free Oracle, I still felt like it kind of got a little lost. It does a little bit better for me in the central position because I feel like the other cards do a little bit better job supporting it in that way. But I still feel like it was a little bit overpowered by everything else that was on the table. But it does pair really beautifully in terms of, you know, being very cohesive in its art style. The messages in the guidebook are really wonderful. So I really did enjoy that in that aspect, but I really felt that the Naked Heart, as I mentioned, really kind of came into its own more if I let it stand on its own as a single card pull. And it worked really well for me for my Wednesday readings for that. I then, of course, did also work with the two Wild Unknown decks together on their own, where I basically put an animal energy in the middle and I had the Wild Unknown Tarot around it to create the expanded message, which I think worked really well. So here we would have the owl, that would be our energy to focus on. Our Six of Wands, I think that's Wands, yes, would be our message, and the Hanged Man would be an expansion of that message. You could also look at this as, you know, what you're leaving behind and what you're tapping into as you move through that owl energy. That's another beautiful way to work with these cards. And of course, being that these cards are by the same creator and the artwork is very cohesive and they do read quite beautifully together. In fact, I enjoy working with these two decks together. Both of them working with them together rather than as individual decks. I think they work much better for me working with them as a pairing rather than just individually on their own. But you can see here, I mean, we get just beautiful messages from these cards. So in the same respect, another pairing that I did was putting the Connected and Free Oracle in the middle as my center point, and then letting my Wild Unknown Tarot provide that expanded message. Look at this one. We have the Moon and the High Priestess, both moon cards in between the sun's rays. So how beautiful is that? That idea of really balancing those two energies, right? Bringing them into balance, bringing them into focus, letting them support each other. I think that's beautiful. These two decks work beautifully together. I do love the cohesiveness between the artwork, but the Connected and Free does feel different enough that it doesn't kind of blend in or bleed into the Wild Unknown Tarot. On occasion, working with the two Wild Unknown decks together, I found that sometimes they kind of bled together. Because as you can see here, this is a wonderful example. The Wild Unknown has a lot of line work in it. Lots of straight lines, you know, bursts and lines and hatch shapes and all that kind of stuff in it. Sometimes when you threw one of the Wild Unknown animal cards in there, it just kind of created a little bit of chaos almost. And I found that the Connected and Free actually worked really well to kind of create some space and to create some breathing room between the Wild Unknown cards. So I did really enjoy working with these two together. I think they read beautifully together, and there's a lot of cohesion between the not only the artwork but the messages of the decks. So here we have Decision sitting between the Mother of Cups and the Hierophant. It's interesting. So I definitely enjoyed working with these four decks together. I think that they, for the most part, read really well together. Certainly these three. The Naked Heart just kind of wanted to stand alone and do its own thing, so that is totally cool. And I was able to kind of find a way to work with it in a way that seemed to resonate a little bit more strongly with the deck. So those are the primary decks that I worked with throughout January. We had the Naked Heart Tarot, the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit, the Connected and Free Oracle, and the Wild Unknown Tarot. And then the little Black Lily snuck its way in there from time to time for readings. And of course, my little Morgan Greer in a tin also snuck its way in because it was new and it wanted to come out and play. So the deck that I'm actually studying throughout this first few months of the year is the Witch's Wisdom Tarot. I did make a new bag for it because I found that the little sisal or whatever it was on the bag that came with it, as beautiful as that was, it actually irritated my allergies, so I had to make a bag for it. But this deck does come in a nice box with a beautiful bag, which is not something that we see very often, and I do really appreciate it, except for it irritated my allergies. So this is the Witch's Wisdom, which is a deck that I am working on doing a deep dive with. Beautiful deck that I have really been enjoying working with. I have read the guidebook now cover to cover. I am creating a journal for it, which is here. I will share that journal at some point, maybe in an upcoming journal video, but I want to get a little bit further along in it before I really share what's in there. I'm really enjoying getting to know this deck. I am working with it very slowly because I'm doing a deep dive with it. I have been doing sort of daily polls and journaling with it, and really getting to know the structure behind this deck because it does depart a little bit from our traditional Rider-Waite-Smith, or actually quite a bit because the majors are actually in reverse, because when you read the guidebook you will see that the journey is not to the Father's heaven as we see in traditional Rider-Waite-Smith decks, but down into the womb of Mother Earth. And I do quite like that idea. It's definitely something that is different. It's a different approach to the tarot and not something that we have seen. In my personal experience, I've never seen that before in a deck, so it's been really interesting. So here we see one is the world, and I do really enjoy that different take on it. It's a very witchy, pagan kind of expression of the tarot, which I do quite enjoy. But because it is different and because there is so much depth to this deck, I am taking my time and really doing a deep dive into it. Since I feel like my journey with this deck has really just begun, I don't really want to go into too much detail yet, but I did just want to share that this is the deck that I'm currently deep dive studying, really working in depth with, getting to know and working with on a very mindful and almost daily, not quite every day, but pretty much close to daily basis, and that is the Witch's Wisdom Tarot. So now that we've had a chance to take a look at the decks that I worked with, let's talk real quick about just a couple of the books that I read. I did not get as much reading done in January as I would have liked to, or that I normally would have. It's just, I don't know, start of a new year. It was just a busy month and I didn't have much time to read. So the fiction book that I did end up reading is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a wonderful fairy tale book. It is basically a reimagining of the fairy tale of the miller's daughter, who in this case spins silver into gold. It has a very magical fantasy world energy to it. It does have some fae, it definitely has some magic, and it's just a wonderful fairy tale, like a grown-up fairy tale. It's a beautiful read. I really have been enjoying Naomi Novik's work. She is the author of Uprooted, and that was a book that I had mentioned in my 2020 favorite books, that was definitely one of my favorite fiction reads. She does have another book out that I am hoping to get here and start soon, but I'm currently reading another book, so we'll have to wait on that one till I finish because I am trying to stay focused and only reading one fiction title and one nonfiction title at a time rather than jumping around to 500 other books, because that's typically what I do. So for my nonfiction title, I actually have started The Year of the Witch by Temperance Aldine. So this is a book that I've started in January and I am still working my way through. I'm trying to go a little bit more slowly with my nonfiction to give me plenty of time to study, to do additional research if I need, to write things down. One of the things that I really appreciated about The Year of the Witch, which says connecting with nature's seasons through intuitive magic. So one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that I've been finding a lot of more seasonal witchy books, which is fantastic. But a lot of them are really rooted in that, in the Wicca religion, and that's not a path that I in particular follow. And so what I really appreciate about Year of the Witch is that it does follow more of sort of a folk magic path. However, I'm not that far into the book, so I can't really give you a full recap of the book or really give you my final thoughts, but so far I am really enjoying it. I did read, or I should say I started reading a couple other books in January. Again, that seasonal witchcraft type of book, because there does seem to be some new ones out there. But the first ones that I came across were, as I mentioned, very steeped in that Wiccan tradition or in the Wiccan religion. And that's just not a path that I follow anymore. It was my path many, many years ago, but since then I've kind of moved into more of a, I don't know what you would call it. It's just my own path. It's all the pieces and parts of things that I've kind of cultivated over the years to create my own little path through the witchy forest. So this one, it kind of took me a little bit longer to get into just because I'd kind of started some of the other ones and just found they weren't really working for me. The Year of the Witch, though, I am finding that it is working a lot better for me. I like that it's a little bit more open, and it definitely has, like I said, that kind of folk magic, intuitive magic feel to it, which does fall a lot more closely in line with the way that my personal practice is. So I'm really enjoying it. So since I have my little planner here sitting in my lap, let's talk just real quick about what's coming up on my channel in February. I've had kind of a theme going. I don't know if you noticed. January was kind of all about journaling. I did my How to Start a Tarot Journal series, which is something that I've been working on for a really long time. So I was really thrilled to get that out in January. February is gonna kind of be a little bit about moon and deity. So a couple of videos that I'm going to be sharing with you in February are videos on the decks I work with for the new or dark moon and the deity I work with during that time, as well as those that I work with on the full moon as well. I also have a fun little video on how I work with my Danielle Noel decks. Now, I do kind of have a video on that already, but I didn't have the Star Child back then when I made that video. It was how I worked with the Moon Child and kind of some of the Oracle decks. And this one, I'm kind of just wanted to do an update to kind of share with you how I'm working with all of those decks together and how they're working out for me, and kind of a combo type video. Speaking of combo videos, another couple of videos that I have coming out in February are some walkthrough / deck combo videos, because I have a couple new decks that have come into my collection that I wanted to share with you. But then I also wanted to play with how they might pair with some of the decks I already have in my collection, or how some of the decks that I have in my collection might support them. So that was a lot of fun. I'm really excited about those. We'll be taking a look at those throughout February. So hopefully February will be another fun month of deck sharing, videos, journaling, all the kind of good stuff. So I hope you had a wonderful January, and I wish you many blessings moving into February. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.